First speaker we have is actually probably the first person. This is actually the fourth year of Nature in Focus. And he's probably the first person who's talking twice in Nature in Focus. Okay? And there's a reason for that. As photographers, most of us are photographers, I think our dream has been to be in that, that magazine with that yellow border, yellow rectangle. We want our pictures to be in there. And this person here started as a student in biology, ecology, whatever. And he's the only person, as far as I know, from Asia who has his pictures got published in National Geographic magazine. So I'm not going to give it away. Prasenjeet, can I have you on stage?
Hello. Can you all hear me? Yeah. I haven't published yet. On my way. I'm just happy to see you all here. I constantly keep having doubts about the track I'm going on because I keep changing my tracks, and I keep reaching out to Divya Mudappa, who's there, back sitting there, asking questions about what I'm doing. And last time I spoke to her, she might be ecologist for all of you, but for some crackpots like me, she's more like a psychologist. So last time I spoke to her, she told me that if some institutions, some organizations, some people call you again and again, be sure you're doing fine. So I'm truly humbled and thankful to Kalyan and Rohit to invite me here. And I'm very comfortable speaking about the stories I work on. But today he has asked me to speak about my personal story, which is, my apology if it sounds too much about me, my learnings, my realizations, if it sounds like main babuji main. This is not a retirement speech, but my story started here. I was born in the middle of central India in a place very close to Nagpur, at my father's farm in very forest ranges where Rudyard Kipling wrote his Jungle Book. My childhood was amazing because we had tigers and leopards in our backyard, and people step out and go into wilderness to see wildlife, and I used to just step out of my house. And I grew up listening to stories about nature and wildlife, and then something weird happened, school. I was forced into a school where all my classmates used to speak about only one thing, cricket, which I'd never understood. And I used to go in between them, and they're like, hey, Sachin played like this. And I used to be like, hey, I saw a leopard yesterday. And they all used to think I'm making this up. And I started figuring out in what way can I tell that I actually saw that leopard, and it was with cubs. And that's when photography as a medium attracted me. There were National Geographic magazines, there was Sanctuary magazine. It took me 8 years cleaning my father's vehicle every morning, 6 a.m. to get my first camera. And I got it back in 2009. And I started taking pictures of natural world around me. And I got one picture, and I went to a friend of mine, and I was like, hey, see this picture, this is really cool. And he was like, you know what you should do with this? You should post it on INW. That's the thing, that's the place where you reach out to other photographers, talk to them about what's happening, they comment on your pictures, and this is way before Facebook. This is where I got introduced to Sudhir Shivrams and Kalyans and Dhritimans, and this is where I got to know what wildlife photography is. And I continued my journey. I went to other parks and started taking better pictures, and my quest for what is a good picture started there. While this time was going on, I also realized living in Nagpur, I had become a tiger expert, which everyone knows, most of the people in that landscape are. But I was studying molecular biology, and I realized that expert is a scary word. And expert is really scary word because there's no right and no wrong. So I started looking out for better opportunities to study more about science and ecology, and somehow Dr. Uma Ramakrishnan from NCBS accepted me, and I started working in her lab on tigers. This picture was taken on the last day of my field work, and after this, shit work started. Literally, shit work. I got grounded to a lab where I was extracting DNA from tiger poop, and that DNA was giving us treasure trove of information about tiger movement in Central India and South India, but I was totally grounded to a lab. That was also a time when photography took a different turn for me. I started using camera, even as I was grounded to this lab, I started exploring the gardens around me and started using camera, one camera body, one lens, and torchlight to figure out how can I create different perspectives. This is when Shankar happened to me, Ganesh happened to me, and I was figuring out ways to create better pictures. And I realized that I don't have to go to a tiger reserve to make wildlife pictures. And all of this went on and on till a point when all this happened in NCBS, in this small campus. And this kept happening till a point when our group of researchers, we published a paper. And this paper went into an international journal, and after almost 3 years of working, I went home to show it to my mother with a lot of excitement. And my mom looked at that paper, and then she looked at me, and she was like, son, I'm very proud of you, and I love you, but I have no clue what this paper means. At that point, I realized that there's this big gap that exists between scientific and the non-scientific community. People outside my institute had no clue what the big deal about conservation and wildlife sciences was about. Why is it that people should care about it? And that's because the language of science is very technical. It is very detailed. It's very objective. And it has to be. So this was the point when I decided to probably step out of science, probably step out of my research, and explore possibilities if I can make photography more than just a hobby. And I reached out to this person who I thought at that point, who I still idealize, but at that point was someone everyone knew and we still know. And I reached out to him and I said, can I join you as an assistant? And I made other researchers also to call him and recommend me and all. And that guy was like, okay. And I spent a year with Kalyan. Following Kalyan, when he was doing his conservation story, he was following wolves. I was following him. He was following wolves. Wolves were following lambs. Lambs were following Mahindra Khatal. And in that 1 year, I learned a lot about coexistence. I learned a lot about conservation and photography. And I wanted to do more than that. And that was probably the same time, back in 2013, when Savers magazine gave me a story. And I spoke about this story last time, but in brief, I went to this one plateau to document the species and biodiversity that lived there, and I was still experimenting and figuring out what makes a better picture, how can I create better conservation pictures, how can I create better aesthetically beautiful pictures. And I came back with not only a conservation story, but also a pure ecology story where these researchers figured out that how these windmills are changing the physiology, biology, as well as morphology of these small lizards in this small plateau. And almost after a year, I went back to the same research institute to show this stuff to other researchers. And almost after a year, I managed to meet my research advisor. And I showed this to her, and she was like, you know what, this is cool. This is cool because you're telling a science story using pictures. And that was the point I realized probably I'm not that useless. I can probably use photography to do something more than just taking pictures. And she said, why don't you go to Sikkim and document some of the research that is happening there? And that's how this project started, in which I went to Sikkim to document 12 research projects which were happening in combination with each other about climate change and how climate change is destructing local biodiversity across elevational gradient. And I came back with a set of images which I put together, weaved them together, and created a larger story which these researchers presented to Forest Department, as well as their funders. And for the first time, the funders were not seeing a 100-page report, but they were seeing what actually was happening there, with each picture, set of lines, and they were like, okay, this is really cool, and the research got more extension, they got more funding. And that was the point I was like, this is what I want to do. And one more thing happened, that is, while doing this, I got paid. I saved that money and I could buy my first ever camera. This took it ahead. This story got published in national magazines, but my reach was entirely restricted. And that's when I figured out that I have to find other ways so I can reach out to international audience. And that's when I got to know about this National Geographic Young Explorers grant. And I applied there to do a story on this research paper. Now, two new genera of songbirds represent endemic radiation from Shola sky islands of the Western Ghats of India. The researchers were super excited about this, but no one else could make sense of what these phylogenetic trees were. So this story started, and I ended up working on the sky islands. And now, even if you wake me up at night, I would say, like, sky islands are these mountaintops peeking out of the clouds. And as they are high up in the sky, they are called as sky islands. They are surrounded by clouds instead of water. And as they are high up in the sky, they are sky islands. And they are very similar to Galapagos, but high up in the sky. Again, during this project, I was still pushing myself to figure out how I can learn better techniques so I could document the behavior as well as the landscape of these subjects to be able to create compiling images that can draw attention. And I learned underwater photography, aerial photography, and Kalyan by then had moved into filmmaking, so I used to sneak out many of his lenses every now and then. But these quests for better pictures still remain, and I still didn't have answer of what is a good image. Even though I had stepped out of academics, I was still in the realm of science. Even then, when I was watching these species, that what species found on what mountain, I was more interested in why this species found on this mountain. And that's why I started collaborating with more researchers, and this story came out a few weeks ago in National Geographic Web. You can check it out there. But almost for 9-10 months, I was doing this story under this grant, which I got from National Geographic Explorers grant, and I had no communication with them. I was sending them emails, I was sending them pictures, but I was one of the maybe hundreds of explorers they have, and I don't know why they were not responding to me, but I was some kid from India writing to them every now and then. And one fine morning, I got an email saying that we have our first Explorers Festival, and we really want to invite you to come to the headquarters in National Geographic. And I was like, yeah, this is amazing. The next line was, we won't be able to provide your transportation. And I was like, okay, damn. That's a problem because I had no savings. Whatever little bit savings, I was like, whatever it is, I have to go for this. So the same day, I took a train back to Nagpur because the event was 40 days down the line, and I didn't have a passport. So I spent that 40 days somehow getting passport and visa, and I got my visa almost 4 hours before I had to book my flight, and on my way from embassy to airport, I booked my first international return ticket, and it worked out. And I went to the headquarters of National Geographic. And that was magical. For me, as a kid growing up looking at National Geographic magazine, it was a very big deal to be there, standing and listening amongst all these stalwarts of photography, from whom I've learned so much, from whom I wanted to learn so much. And there were a bunch of explorers, there were researchers, and there were photographers. And I found myself standing bang in the middle of both of them. I could communicate with both photographers as well as researchers. And I realized that's probably my strength. And things completely changed for me after that. I was traveling constantly. I went to Indonesia, speaking to thousands of students, explaining them how to write grants and how to generate money so you could do your research stories as well as your photography stories as well as your storytelling stories. I happened to be at the Telluride Mountain Film Festival where I could speak about issues that are happening in India, about mountains in India, about Himalayas, about Western Ghats, about climate change. The cool thing was I went to the biggest adventure film festival in the world, where I was sitting with all the adventurers, talking to them about my little bit adventure in Western Ghats and telling that adventure without purpose, according to me, is useless. And it went really well. And I also got opportunities to work with larger forums of National Geographic, where I could now tell my story, which was about you don't have to go to a tiger reserve to do wildlife photography. We did this series on urban wildlife where almost 32 million people around the world participated, submitted pictures, and the idea was to tell them that wildlife is not only in tiger reserve. The butterfly in your backyard, the ant in your house is also a wildlife. And we need to give them their wild identity back. And things in my photography career took another turn when National Geographic magazine sent me to attend a very esteemed photojournalism workshop called as Missouri Photojournalism Workshop, which happens in Missouri. And I was forced there to do a people story. I was the youngest photographer, and I had no experience of how to do people stories. So I chose to do a story on children adoption. And during that workshop, with all the amazing mentors we had there, Jim Richardson, Lynn Johnson, Randy Olson, we learned that if you want to do better photography, you really have to keep working towards becoming a better human being. You have to find what you truly believe into and figure out a way how you can transmit that passion to larger audience. And that's when I started thinking, what is it that I truly believe into? And that was science communication. And this workshop resulted into next workshop, which was Shoot for Science, where the idea was to bring in scientists from India in a group where we can talk to them about storytelling and figure out how can we teach them the art of photography so they can tell their own science stories to larger audience using photography. And we got hundreds of applications, and Anand Verma, who's a close collaborator, he co-taught this workshop, and we both ran them through the process of how we create these stories, how we move from one science publication all the way to a photo story. And it went amazing. I don't have enough time to show all the pictures, but what these participants created was, this is one of the pictures where the story was about how bees keep time. Do they follow our circadian time scale of day and night, or is it the food, which are these pollens, that drive their life cycle? I still have 3 minutes. And then we created these pictures of these scientists there, as well as the process of how they do the science. This is a bee which is about to go in a brain surgery. And we created these pictures where one picture could tell the entire story. This story was about good microbes, that all the microbes in the world are not bad. There are certain microbes which are good and play an important role in your human-animal development. And in this picture, what you see is a caterpillar, which is on a leaf. And the idea is when the caterpillar feeds on the leaf, it also feeds on the bacteria that lives on that leaf. And that bacteria plays a vital role in the development of this caterpillar. This workshop was, even though short, it translated into something large. One of our participants, after this workshop, ended up publishing a story in The Science, which I think is a big deal. I'm not taking credit for it, but I felt really happy that it's not only me who's trying to tell these science stories using pictures today. Now there are other people in India, those who are doing this. And the next and the last turn that happened so far in photography was my Mexico trip, where National Geographic magazine hired me as an assistant to help another senior photographer. And we were documenting and photographing these large carnivorous bats, the largest carnivorous bats in the world, which live in this abandoned Mayan temple in the middle of a rainforest. And Anand, who is a close collaborator, as well as many other people I work with, have always told me, and many other photographers also told me, that in our field of photography, you know that you're becoming successful when your idols become your competitors. And I think that's rubbish. I think that's total rubbish. I think real success is when your idols become your collaborators. And I'm totally blessed that all my idols that I've worked with so far are my collaborators today. And now I'm looking forward to collaborate with next set of people. I'm working on this new book, children's book, in which I'm collaborating with this girl, Nirupa, who's probably the best illustrator, and we are creating picture and illustration book. And the idea is that we reach out to larger audience, and I'm also trying to figure out how I can learn from other artists to make sure that my pictures are not only about me or only about the stories. How can science communication can become bigger than just these pictures? But my quest still remains. And the other way I'm trying to figure out to reach out to larger audiences is trying to make films. So this is a film that I'm trying to make on this Sky Island story. And this time lapse was done to show that these mountains are not isolated only by deep valleys, but also by a lot of urbanization. I started doing this time lapse around 1 a.m. near Metupalayam, and there were 2,000 images which were clicked simultaneously, one after another. Each image was a 15 seconds exposure and 10 seconds gap. And after next morning when I looked through these images, I realized that in one of those 2,000 images, I got something really out of the world. Literally, out of the world. This is probably the only composed picture of a green meteorite. This guy can show up for a fraction of a second anywhere in the universe, and no photographer can plan this shot. Now, I was sleeping when my camera took this picture. So how I like to explain this picture is, for that fraction of a second, for those 15 seconds, I was probably the luckiest photographer on the planet. But I was also the only idiot doing that time lapse there. But this picture, again, taught me more about my quest of what is a good picture. I grew up reading that every picture is made up of only 3 elements: the subject, the aesthetics of the photographer, and the technicalities. This picture makes me rethink that concept. This picture makes me believe that every picture is made up of only 2 elements: a reality and a dream. And a good picture is the one where you can't tell the difference. Thank you.